U.S. President Trump's tariffs on metal imports may be an extraordinary measure, but it's not unprecedented. The last time a U.S. administration tried implementing them didn't go so well. In 2002, President George W. Bush imposed tariffs on steel imports as high as 30%. It was to protect the U.S. steel industry from cheap steel flooding the market. They targeted the EU, China, Japan, and Brazil, amongst others. Canada and Mexico, though, were exempted. But Bush pulled the tariffs 20 months later, in part because the World Trade Organization ruled them illegal. But also, the tariffs backfired. According to one analysis, the tariffs wiped out 200,000 American jobs, and they cost the economy $30 million. So how different is this round of tariffs? Are they likely to have the same negative effect on the U.S. economy? Joining me now from Chicago is Phil Levy. He's a senior fellow on the global economy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He also served as a trade advisor to U.S. President George W. Bush. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I wonder how much sympathy do you have for the position of Donald Trump right now, given that you were involved in an administration that did put forward tariffs on steel?
I have no sympathy for the position of Donald Trump. I think this is a terrible action. The administration I served did not lash out at our allies in Canada.
Okay, so what instruction then would you offer to Canada at this point as it looks to deal with this? As you, I'm sure, know, Canada has talked about retaliatory measures, although they won't come into effect for about a month now. Do you think that that's the right way to proceed?
Well, I'm not in the business of advising other governments. I try to stick to my own. I will note this. If you look at how other countries have dealt with this administration, those who have come up with a more robust response have often done better. If you want to compare, for example, Japan's experience with that of China, Japan tried to play nice, came, visited, chatted, Mar-a-Lago, the whole works, and they got hit with these steel tariffs even earlier. They got hit months ago with them. They have slowly come around to retaliation. The Chinese threatened retaliation right off the bat, and they got at least a temporary truce. So you can draw your own conclusions from that.
Okay, let's turn our minds back to your experience in the Bush administration. Those tariffs, of course, did not affect Canada and Mexico, but let's talk about what the overall impact of them was. What lessons do you think were learned from that?
Well, I'm not going to sort of argue that they were a good idea. I don't think they were. I generally think that trade protection backfires, that it's meant to help out an industry, but industries are interconnected, and you end up paying a price. I think that's what happened in the U.S. case in the early part of President Bush's term. They were intended to get the steel industry back on its feet and doing well, and what we have seen since then have been sort of a long stream of requests for continued protection. So it was not a path to independence, self-sufficiency, and success.
Well, in fact, if I understand correctly, you didn't think they were a great idea at the time either, but your argument didn't win the day. And I wonder, when we see the situation around President Trump right now, people who are trying to change his mind about this and aren't necessarily succeeding, do you have any advice?
Yeah, well, I joined the administration after the tariffs were already in place. I helped take them off. I think for the current administration, one of the real problems that you're seeing is that the norm of making American trade policy is that you have a very careful, deliberative process. That doesn't mean it always comes up with the right answers. It doesn't. But you at least see all the different perspectives. I think one of the things that's been very unusual about the Trump administration is they seem to have discarded much of that deliberative process. It has to go with either a small coterie of advisors or the president's gut instincts. And so they're not perhaps getting the full picture. And I think you're getting a lower quality of advice than we've had either under previous Democratic or Republican administrations.
And so how could outsiders hope to improve the situation at all? What hope can there be for people in the position of Canada, who has been involved, the Canadian administration, in a charm offensive for quite some time now that evidently, based on what's happening this week, doesn't seem to be working?
Well, I think if you want to decide whether Canada's approach has been working or not, to really make that analysis, you have to say compared to what. Canada has been faced for over a year now with a president who has publicly expressed his eagerness to kill NAFTA. He started trying to do that in April of 2017 and has not yet sort of detonated the device. as it were. So you could argue that in and of itself is a success. So you have to say compared to what. In terms of what options are open, I think it's worth remembering that in the United States, there's multiple sources of sort of power and influence. I don't think the advisors sitting next to President Trump are particularly empowered. On the other hand, at least according to our Constitution, the power to regulate trade sits with the U.S. Congress. They've delegated a lot of that. But one of the most striking things that you heard yesterday in the wake of this fiasco was top voices in Congress on trade policy speaking out and expressing their extreme dissatisfaction. We'll see whether they get moved to action, but you also have voices coming from key sectors. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce said that they were unhappy with this. The United Steelworkers said they were unhappy with this. So I think working through those channels, and I think one of the reasons the United Steelworkers said this was because they have hundreds of thousands of Canadian steelworkers who are part of their organization. So those kind of linkages, those kind of connections, they bolster the sort of voices that can help perhaps turn this around.
You call it a fiasco. Do you have any sense of how long it might take for this fiasco to end, when it might be turned around?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question because the problem is the administration has not, the Trump administration has really not set itself up with an easy off-ramp to this one. They've kind of put it in a position where they've taken a foolish action, and now either Canada and Mexico just decide to succumb, and Europe, and Japan, or they have to back down. So a couple of possibilities. One, they decide to back down and they adopt whatever sort of face-saving measure they can on this. Two, Congress steps in and tries to do something, which they have the power to do, but perhaps not the inclination. Or three, this goes on for a while and we have to live with it. I don't think we're going to be in a complete steady state. The administration has already made clear that it wants to move on and do the same thing with automobiles. So that will cause its own set of problems. So we'll see whether it has to get worse before it gets better.
Well, given what the situation you've just described, it does seem like a lot of the discussion around NAFTA, which is obviously linked to this, hinges around Canada and Mexico's unwillingness to accept this 5-year sunset clause. Would you advise Canada to just suck it up to avoid the pain that you're describing?
No, I wouldn't. I think that this is the one issue on which I will sort of differ from Prime Minister Trudeau, in that I don't think that the countries were particularly close to reaching a NAFTA agreement. It's worth remembering that not only did you need to get consensus among the three sets of negotiators, you also needed to have something which had the support of the respective national legislatures. That's a bit easier in Canada just because of the parliamentary system. In the U.S., you have a sharp divide right now between the president and the Republican leaders in Congress, even though they are nominally of the same party. So I don't think that something like a sunset clause would win votes in the U.S. Congress. You've had congressional leaders say that. You've had the U.S. Chamber of Commerce say that. So I don't think this was a thing that was sort of tantalizingly close. I don't think the administration set that one up for success either.
Just today, Trump talked about the possibility of separate deals with Mexico and with Canada. Would that be a better route, do you think? No,
I don't think so. I think that there was a lot to be said for doing an integrated North American economy. I think this is a fairly transparent divide and conquer strategy on the part of the Trump administration. And it doesn't actually solve any of the sort of fundamental problems that you have, which are both, as I mentioned, the disagreements between the president and the leadership in Congress, but also the fact that under U.S. law, you don't really have time to get an agreement through the current Congress, even if you had a signing ceremony this weekend. And they're not going to have a signing ceremony this weekend.
Well, it is not a particularly rosy picture, but Phil Levy, we still thank you for taking the time to walk us through it.
Sorry, I can't bring better news.